Um, Let the record reflect that counsel for both parties are present. Ms. Simon is present with her counsel. I have received a note, and it says we have reached a verdict. And Mr. Bryant, if you would mark this as a court's exhibit as well. I believe we're up to 7. Okay. And if the parties wish to see this note, you're welcome. Okay, then I'll hand this back down, Mr. Blake. Okay. So. And you may, if you would, please call in the jury. Thank you.
Jurors entering. Jury room is clear, Your Honor.
All right, thank you, Deputy Smith. All right, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you may have a seat. Thank you very much. And I understand that you have received a verdict. I just want to say, first of all, to those who are in the audience, there has been a jury verdict reached. To everyone in attendance, and many of you have been here for quite some time, I will ask that there not be any emotional reactions and no disruptive outbursts. So at this point, I am going to ask the foreperson to please stand. Juror 5. And have you reached a verdict?
Yes, we have.
Was it unanimous?
Yes, it was.
Has the verdict been filed in or filled in and signed and dated by you?
Yes, it has.
And if you would please hand the verdict to Deputy Solomon. Thank you, Deputy Solomon, for handing that up. I'm going to ask counsel to approach and take a look at the verdict form. As to the verdict, it reads as follows. We, the jury, find as follows: malice murder. We find the defendant guilty. Count 2, felony murder. We find the defendant guilty. Count 3, felony murder. We find the defendant guilty. Count 4, concealing the death of another. We find the defendant guilty. Count 5, false report of a crime. We find the defendant guilty. Count 6, making a false statement. We find the defendant guilty. Count 7, making a false statement. We find the defendant guilty. Count 8, making a false statement. We find the defendant guilty. Count 9, making a false statement. We find the defendant guilty. Count 10, making a false statement. We find the defendant guilty. Count 11, making a false statement. We find the defendant guilty. Count 12, making a false statement. We find the defendant guilty. Count 13, making a false statement. We find the defendant guilty. Count 14, making a false statement. We find the defendant guilty. Count 15, making a false statement. We find the defendant guilty. Count 16, making a false statement. We find the defendant guilty. Count 17, making a false statement. We find the defendant guilty. Count 18, making a false statement. We find the defendant guilty. And count 19, making a false statement. We find the defendant guilty. And is there anything further from the state? From the defense?
We asked both.
Certainly. So, members of the jury, this is something that very often happens. You will be asked questions by the clerk, 3 questions in particular, I believe, and simply answer the questions. Madam Clerk.